this is almost what feels like an assault on the protein industry by the United States government. Government regulations going on right now as I speak. Several events that have occurred since the beginning of this year that are going to put pressure on chicken, poultry, pork, and beef operations in the United States. Hey guys, welcome back to Yanasa TV. I want to talk about the protein market today because what is happening right now is going to impact your ability to buy protein for the foreseeable future. And when you put all of these events together and you see what's happening, it's real hard to say that our government is doing much to help the situation. In fact, most of what I'm seeing is that it's going to make things a lot worse than anything we've ever seen before. So I'm going to go through some of these scenarios. Some of them we've talked about on this channel before, with a little bit of more information, new information that I'm throwing in there. But before I get started today, let me just my workshop's a little dirty. Let me first start off with thanking the Buffalo Wool Company. He's been supportive of our channel. He's going to be the first sponsor of the As a Man Thinketh series. If you're interested in participating in the As a Man Thinketh series, you can contact me, info@yanasaranch.com, I believe it is. But I'd love to talk to you guys, tell you a little more about how we're going to run this. With the way things have been going in the economy, believe it or not, even people who do videos like this on YouTube are facing some economic shortfalls as advertising dollars slip. So it becomes more and more difficult for us to be able to take time out of our day to be able to provide you guys with these videos because we have to do other things. In some ways, it's kind of, it feels like with the whole small film groups, non-news groups, the people who are out there doing these types of videos or like our documentary videos, it almost seems like it's becoming very economically challenging. Even with our documentary, we've been trying to figure out how to get a couple of us out to Yellowstone to get some snow shots this year, but now as of October, you have to have all sorts of permits, and basically, unless you're a big player, you're out of the game. And I think that is intentional. I think that in many ways, the industry, the YouTube industry, people creating videos, people reporting on news events and doing their own research and being able to share that with others that are unconventional ways, I feel like in many ways it's threatened the larger industry. If you watch the stats of groups like CNN, they've been plummeting. A lot of that has to do with lying to the general public and the public finding out because other people are doing research and reporting on it. But I think over the next few years, we're going to see more and more challenges brought against independent producers. So I definitely appreciate the Buffalo Wool Company's support of our channel. And so they're our first official sponsor of As a Man Thinketh. And on that note, if you guys wanted to contribute to the native film, we are trying to raise funds right now to get our groups out there and get some great footage of the bison. But this video, it does impact the bison industry a little bit, I think. But it's more geared towards cattle and egg production. And I've been watching the pork industry as well, because I think that is going to be kind of the next shoe to fall once these are under better control of falling. Let's start off with egg and chicken because we've talked about egg and chicken recently. A lot of people think that there's some sort of eggspiracy against the feed. In my last video, I talked about this a little bit. I do think that it's very coincidental that an eggplant caught on fire at the same time we're facing massive egg shortages across the United States. But as I said in the video, most of the impacts on the egg industry are coming from this highly unusual strain of bird flu. Now, bird flu is something that normally lasts for a couple months. It starts off in the spring as birds migrate and dies fairly quickly in the summertime. The bird flu last year didn't do that. It's a highly unusual strain. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but it was able to spread throughout the summer and into the winter. We lost in the US 60 million birds last year. That's a lot more than what we lost in 2015. We're going into this year with the bird flu still running rampant. I mean, it is actually spreading, and it's spread more so than it had when we started the spring migration last year. So what you're going to see is that this bird flu comes back with a vengeance in the spring and wipes out even more of our eggs and our poultry. What I think is going to happen, or what is actually happening right now in February, is APHIS has put out a public commenting period for an EIS report, which is an environmental and impact report, that will provide guidance to the USDA on how to handle the bird flu going into 2023. In 2022, they didn't really do a whole lot with the bird flu. They did a whole lot back in 2015. So my guess is that they're going to look at this bird flu situation, especially now that they've seen it transferring into mammals like minks and grizzly bears. I think there was a fox at one point in time that had it. It's made its way into mammals, and they're concerned about this particular strain being able to metamorphize even more, which could impact humans. And bird flu and humans don't mix very well. It's actually a much higher percentage fatality rate than something like COVID. So I think that what we're going to see is we're going to start seeing implementations of things like restrictive bird flu from state to state. And this is going to impact everybody from backyard chicken growers to commercial flock growers. There's probably going to be a special permitting process for commercial flock growers. You're going to see less power given to, unfortunately, people with backyard birds in these scenarios, especially if you have to go through a whole permitting process. Right now, we actually were supposed to be getting a bunch of birds today, but because of the ice storm and everything else, they actually stopped bird shipments this week, which was probably a good idea because if they get stuck somewhere in an ice storm, those birds don't have food and water until they get to their final destination. So that could be critical for the birds. But from what I'm hearing from our local store where we order, they're seeing an astronomical amount of requests for birds, more than they can fill. And, just to give you an idea, we'd have to get there, if the birds arrive at like 10 or 11 in the morning, we'd have to get there before 9 just to get a number and wait in line to have a selection of birds. So my suggestion to you is that knowing that there could be some restrictions coming after this EIS report from APHIS to the USDA, I would try and grow my flock now. And that's really important. But going back to the feed, a lot of people brought up amino acids being missing from the feed. And there is a problem with amino acids in animal feed in general. And this is something that started back in 2021, although not necessarily the type of supply chain disruption that you would necessarily anticipate. So what happened was in 2020, we had the African swine flu decimate the hog herd in China. And China is one of the largest exporters of amino acids in the world. And what happened was you had all of this excess in the amino acid industry because they didn't need the feed because they had to cull all the hogs. Some of you remember this. We talked about it on this channel. The African swine fever has been picking up this year, and that's something I've been watching to see how that spreads and what countries it makes its way back into, especially when we're already dealing with the bird flu. And I'll get to the cattle at the end of this video. But basically, you had this flood of amino acids coming out of China. It flooded into the U.S. industry. And what happened when that happens is it drives the prices down. So we saw this dramatic drop in prices because of this flood of amino acids into the feed industry in the United States. That in turn actually cut back U.S. production, because what happens if you're not making any money off of a product, you cut back on it or you go out of business. And so that influx of amino acids into the feed here, cheap amino acids, actually cut back on U.S. production quite a bit, at least enough that U.S. production is no longer meeting demand. And then what happened is you had a China lockdown, and you had China start to regrow its hog herd in 2020, late 2021, early 2022. Those two events created another disruption in the amino acid industry, because suddenly now we're not getting shipments from China the way that we were, and China has a need for more feed because they're growing not just new herds, but these genetically modified massive pigs in like skyscraper buildings. So this is all happening over the last couple years, and it impacts the amino acids that are available to us to put into to feed. I don't know if you noticed, but for a period of time, if you went into a lot of the consumer stores, Tractor Supply, just any of the, I don't know which store is near you, but there was actually a serious lack of any food at all available on the shelves. Now it seems to be picking back up a little bit. And I think that during that period of time, you definitely had a feed quality issue. You're also going to have feed quality issues with the grains that are being put into the feed right now because of grain disruptions from Ukraine, to the fact that here in the United States, we planted the lowest amount of corn we've planted since 2008 last year. All of this has impacts on the quality of the grain products, but it is something that I think is more wider spread. And I do think that when we have situations like this, the commercial industry is going to outbid, or the government's going to push more of those supplies to the commercial industry to serve the greater good. So they're going to be, you're the quality of feed that we pick up, consumer feed, is going to be greatly diminished compared to that of commercial feed. And those are the realities of the situation. Now, I'm not sticking up for Tractor Supply on this. I haven't been happy with that company since they've been funding things that I disagree with involving children. And I don't think that, I feel like they've got some rough years ahead of them if they keep up what they're doing. The other thing is with grains, you've got all this ESG stuff going on, and so then you start having less quality grains going into animal feed to improve ESG scores and everything else, because they're able to take secondhand grains from grain mills or breweries and put it into the animal feed. It doesn't have the same quality of nutrients that fresh feed would have. Now, going forward, I think that there's going to be some further disruptions when it comes to feed supply in general, and that is we've seen how the impacts of the war in Ukraine could impact grains and other things, but when we look at China, now there was a 4-star general the other day who actually sent orders out to his commanders saying that they needed to prepare their troops for war with China within the next 2 years, is what he thinks. And I agree with him. I actually think it could happen sooner than that. It's interesting. I read a report from an analyst at the beginning of the year, and I actually did a video on it. I just never published it because it was just too depressing when you think about what's happening with geopolitics right now. But just look at the extent of escalation over the last couple of weeks, and nobody seems to be caring about it. It's not a big deal to anybody. Iran gets the heck blown out of them by Israel. Nobody makes a big deal out of it. In fact, they hardly even talk about it. Big news is hardly even covering the subject. When you look at the fact that we're sending tanks to Ukraine, and some countries are sending airplanes to Ukraine, you can't look at this situation anymore and say it's not World War III. In fact, I believe it was our very own president, Biden, who said that if we started sending tanks and planes to Ukraine, that would be the start of World War III. Well, this analyst that I was reading at the beginning of the year talked about all of the geopolitical issues that were going on. And he said that he thought that what we would see is escalating starting in the Middle East. And this is a very dangerous area because it's going to impact oil prices globally. And what he said is actually correct. We actually saw at the beginning of the year attacks from Israel on Iran, and then we just saw that again with the drone strikes on Iran. Something is about to give here. And the other thing that makes me a little perturbed about what happened with the drone strikes from Israel into Iran is that the Ukraine's response was, that's what you get for supporting Russia. So now we have, nobody condemned those comments. In fact, nobody condemned the Ukraine government for stealing taxpayer dollars to buy their Porsches. Instead, we lied about it. But the truth is that those comments from Ukraine are now saying it's okay for this to spill over. You know what? If you support the enemy, then you are a target yourself. And the fact that we don't condemn them for saying that means that we feel the same way. And the second that the mentality of these countries is that if you support this other country, you're a target as well, that's what leads into World War III. And I think that what we're actually seeing here is a decoupling of geopolitics globally. And I think think that China has been playing a waiting game, because if you look at how much equipment we've actually sent into Ukraine, and even Ukraine has said this, and I've heard this more recently, and I thought this from the beginning. In fact, I talked about it on this channel. Russia's been playing a very slow game in Ukraine. And the slower that game plays and the longer this whole thing plays out, the weaker we all become, because we're sending more and more weapons over there. We're sending more and more of our resources over there. We're depleting our oil reserve every single month and day. We can't seem to rebuild it because the oil prices just keep going back up because there's a supply glut globally. What ends up happening is you weaken the West to the point that China can take action. China hasn't been weakened at all. They could take action on Taiwan, and they're in a much better position. A lot of people think that China's waiting for the elections to come up and that we'll see something happen in 2025. This is what the general even thought. My thought is that we're actually going to see something sooner than that. We're actually going to see something prior to the elections, in my opinion. I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not a geopolitical guy, but I pay attention to it because it affects our food supply. When you look at the impact the amino acids had on our animal feed and where we're getting a lot of those amino acids from now, China, if we end up going into conflict with China, it's going to have a major impact on our food supply globally, and especially here in the United States. We have got to figure out a way to bring some of these things back to the U.S. And the U.S. is actually one of the largest producers of amino acids. But what, like I said, happened is when you had this oversupply and it drove prices down, people stopped producing. And this is kind of like the fallout of what happens from there. That said, I think that, feed could get back on track sometime soon. I don't think the bird flu is going away. I think that remains our biggest threat to drive up egg prices and poultry. But let's move on to beef production, because beef production is something I've talked about on this channel a lot. And it's something that I think is impacted for years, and you can see it in the numbers right now. There are a lot of numbers thrown at you in the beef industry, and if you don't understand them, they could be confusing. In fact, they can sound not so bad at all. For example, when you talk about the animals on feed dropping 3% last month, that doesn't sound like a horrible thing. Well, a 3% drop of animals on feed probably isn't going to have that large of an impact on the markets. I'll admit that. We're probably still going to see beef prices remaining relatively stable here over the next month or two, but you should stock up. You should stock up on those meat prices. And in fact, cold storage might be a little high right now, so you may even get some sales. Stock up. Take every dollar you can to stock up on beef, especially if you like to eat burgers and steaks, because things are about to change. When you look at the animals placed on feed, that was a larger drop. It was a drop by 8%. The month before that, it was a drop of 19%. I reported that on this channel. Those drops are, put beef production, the number of animals being placed onto feed, the lowest we've seen since 2012. So you're going back almost a decade here in supply that's coming onto the market. And the demand for beef continues to go up year over year. So when you look at the actual spread here that we're experiencing between the supply of beef and the demand, in the near term, within the next several months, you're going to start seeing some pretty critical shortages from restaurants to grocery stores to your favorite fast food joints when it comes to beef. And that's just the reality of the marketplace, because those 8% numbers, those 19% numbers reflect the future of cattle on feed. But those aren't even the scary numbers. Those aren't the scary numbers, because there are numbers that are far worse than those numbers. Believe it or not, we are actually seeing the lowest amount of heifers on the market for replacement cattle that we've seen since 1962. That's how much the national herd has been reduced over the last couple years. The culling rate's been between 13 to 12%. It's actually, I think it was actually higher than that in 2022. So we've seen this national herd reduction for the last 4 years of drought. This isn't just 1 year. Last year was a significant year because people started hearing about Texas losing 40% of its herd and other key cattle-producing states losing large amounts of their herds. But this has actually been in a reduction phase. The cattle industry has been in a reduction phase for 4 years in a row. And it's not actually going to end in 2023. People think, oh, well, we're seeing snow on the ground. This is going to start reversing in 2023. Analysts don't expect the downtrend in the herd size to reverse until 2025. So if anything, we're starting to see the numbers tighten of cattle on feed. We're starting to see the future numbers tighten of cattle on feed, but we're still reducing our herd sizes. So we're still, in a sense, bringing more cattle to feed than we normally would, or what we would need to do in order to stabilize the market. And this is going to continue for another year. So while you're going to start feeling the supply tighten now, it's not as bad as it's going to get. Believe me, it's going to get a lot worse, because once the market turns and they start rebuilding the herd, what you need is you have the cattle on feed, you have feeder cattle, which are cattle that are being run on grasslands throughout the year, and they're the ones that we're filling up to send to the feedlots. And then you have the cow-calf pair operations, and those are the ones that are so low right now, the lowest we've seen since 1962 and still plummeting. Those operations are declining substantially. The herd size is declining substantially. Without those operations, you don't have feeder cattle, and then you don't have cattle on feed, and then you don't have steaks and burgers. That's how the market works. And so they're not expecting the cow-calf operations to start increasing herd size until about 2025. I think there's going to be a lot of headwinds, though, for this market to turn around even in 2025. And I'm going to get into some of the weather aspects of this that we could expect going into 2025, some of the feed aspects of this, but then there's also government regulations going on right now as I speak. Several events that have occurred since the beginning of this year that are going to put pressure on chicken, poultry, pork, and beef operations in the United States. And I don't think that we're going to see a full recovery to what we saw before. And in fact, if we do, it's going to take years. It's going to take a very long time. This is almost what feels like an assault on the protein industry by the United States government. And I'm saying that in a light kind of way. These policies that are being implemented are absolutely horrific for farmers, for the farming industry. And I don't even like CAFOs. I like to buy my meat locally. I like to buy from a source that's grass-fed, grass-finished. Those are all my preferences. But I also recognize that there are billions of people in this world. And I recognize that when there's a protein shortage for those billions of people in the world, it not only affects them, but it affects me. It affects me with what I want to eat, even what I'm paying for meat that's grown regeneratively. Okay, so let's start off with the cost of feed, because the cost of feed, we all know, is going up. It's going through the roof. We have the war with Ukraine that's cutting back on grains. As I've mentioned before, we saw the lowest corn crop that we've seen in the U.S., harvested corn acres, since 2008. That's a substantial drop in corn yields. And although the USDA is forecasting higher crops this year, that's not hard to do from last year. Believe me. And I actually think that as I get into some of these weather things, you'll see how it may actually be a little more difficult this year when it comes to planting for corn than it was the last couple years. So regardless of drought conditions, I still don't think we're out of the woods when it comes to a lot of the grains that we need for feed. Feed is going to be elevated for an extended period of time. I think that the amino acid market is going to continue to be disrupted for an extended period of time, especially with global conflicts, and those are essential ingredients for feed. So the cost of feeding cattle is going to be substantially higher. And there are other government regulations that are going to make it even more difficult to feed finished cattle. All right, sorry, I have barn cats and they keep meowing at me and it's driving me nuts. Anyway, so point is feed costs are going to remain elevated for a strong period of time. We haven't seen just how bad it's going to get yet, because as we know, Ukraine cut back on 35% of production last year. We're still facing weather-related issues around the globe when it comes to growing the grains. Our stockpiles are depleting. It'll take years to rebuild the stockpiles to a level that would be suitable for inexpensive food production for cattle. And so as long as it costs more money to raise the cows when it comes to feed, you're not going to see as many cows on the market. You're not going to see farmers really wanting to rebuild their herds. The other problem is that I think what we're actually going to see here as we head into this cycle, this cattle cycle, is you generally have 10-year cattle cycles where you have production increase and decrease, increase and decrease. I don't think we're actually going to turn this cattle production cycle around as fast as many people think we are. The average age of a farmer in the United States is 65 years old. That's retirement. They're not going to want to go out and rebuild their cattle herds when they have to basically liquidate now. So I think that you're going to see a large number of some of these ranchers retire. And the other problem is that you're not going to see a lot of families wanting to take over these farms because of the tax implications that they're going to be facing. A lot of the tax laws don't favor the transfer of family farms down to the next generation. So we're facing a lot of headwinds, a lot of administrative headwinds to keep farmers in business. And so I actually do think that we're about to see some consolidation in the industry, some consolidation that will have impacts, again, for everybody who likes to eat protein. And this isn't just with cattle farmers. I think, this bird flu could have a similar effect on the poultry industry. But the point is that you're going to see some consolidation there. And for new farmers starting out, this is not a very good environment because with inflation, we've seen the price of land get so radically out of control, especially when you have countries coming in and buying up land and billionaires buying up farmland everywhere. You're seeing these prices get so out of control that it is not economically viable for somebody to go out and buy farmland to raise animals on. Believe me, I have looked. Because we would love to have, we'd love to be somewhere else than we currently are. I've actually been spending a lot of time out in our fields repairing fences, trying to build our operation here because we don't see how it would be economically feasible to sell this operation and move somewhere else, not with the amount of land that it would require. If you go out west, for example, it takes 40 acres to raise a cow-calf pair. Right now, you're going to pay a couple $1,000s an acre for that 40 acres. Even at $600 or $700 an acre, it's not economically feasible. So if you're looking for that replacement in the industry, the up-and-coming generations, it's not feasible for them to come in and buy the land and to be able to raise the animals on. And like I said, with the way that some of these tax laws and some of the things that the current administration has been trying to do, there's a lot of uncertainty on whether or not some of those farmlands are going to be easily transferred down to the next generation without having to be sold. A lot of the land in the U.S. that is sold by farms goes towards development purposes. It does not go back towards land conservation as some people actually think. In fact, I watched a very interesting film about grizzly bear conservation put out by the Wildlife Conservation Society and another group, which was talking about the importance of keeping ranchers in the United States for conservation purposes, because private land ownership owns a significant amount of land, and once they go under, they go out of business, they're no longer around, that land quickly turns into development, which takes away the habitat for a lot of these incredible animals that we need to have space for. So ranchers are more a part of conservation than I think a lot of people realize. And unfortunately, I see a lot of these groups going out of business, consolidating over the next couple of years because of some of the things that are going on. Drought conditions, I think, are also going to persist. I think that when we look at 2025, there's a danger that in 2025 we see a return to droughts, even if we have a couple good years. And a lot of this is because people, are so focused on climate change, they forget about some of the natural cycles that we face. And I've heard a lot of people talking about grand solar minimum over the past few years and solar cycles, which got me to really start looking into it myself and studying it. And from that, I've been able to actually predict some pretty long-term cycles. For example, I thought that we would end up having a multi-year La Nina event based on the information that I was able to observe and study from having a couple years of studying these solar cycles. Now, one of those reports, Valentina Zarkova, actually predicts that the current solar cycle would have almost an early peak as early as 2023, and then we would kind of dip off, and as far as solar cycle activity, all the way through 2050 something. Okay, so we're talking over 25 years of very low solar activity. The problem that I see with this is that so far, solar cycle 25 mimics exactly what she said would happen. There's been a sharp spike at the beginning of the solar cycle, but what you have to realize is that Valentina Zarkova is measuring total TSI for the solar cycle. If we get a big spike at the beginning of the solar cycle and it dips off, that TSI is just going to curve and drop and be lower than it was in solar cycle 24. TSI is very important because when you're looking at the overall impacts the sun has on all of these different cycles within our ecosystem. I mean, the sun impacts La Nina events, it impacts El Nino, well, obviously the Enso cycle, it impacts a lot of different ocean cycles. And so these are pretty significant things to think about when you look at the growing years between 2019 and 2022 and how difficult they actually were. A lot of that had to do with where the sun was in its cycle. And based on that, yeah, things could get a little easier starting in 2023 going through 2025. But if the sun actually peaks in 2023, 2024, as she predicted instead of 2025, and we see that drop, it's going to be a sharp drop and remain at very low levels. Solar activity would remain at very low levels for the remainder of the solar cycle into 2030 and all the way through the, until several solar cycles after that, 2050s. That would put us in a situation of not just 2 or 3 years of difficult growing conditions, but about 25 years of difficult growing conditions. And we've seen how quickly the system has deteriorated just from 2019 to 2022. And if you look at these 10-year cattle cycles that I was talking about, everything happens in 10 or 11-year cycles, right? Well, that's because of what the sun's activity is doing. When the sun's activity is low, it creates difficult growing conditions, which creates droughts, it creates difficult conditions with getting feed. All of those things impact the cattle industry. And so then you kind of see the cattle industry mimicking that cycle by a couple of years down the road. And that's just, it's following that type of trend. And that's why when you talk to a lot of farmers, they say 10 years on, 10 years off, the climate's always changing. Well, it is always changing because the sun's constantly changing cycles. But long-term cycles are very impactful, and I think that we're about to hit a period of time that we have not seen in our lifetimes. We have not seen since the modern minimum, and a lot of us aren't going to know how to handle it. And I think that's going to have a larger impact on the recovery of the current cattle cycle that we're in, the drop that's going to continue for another 2 years before it rebuilds, and I think it will prevent it from rebuilding. So this is going to be an extended period, more so than we have seen in previous cattle cycles, in my opinion, just when it comes to weather. But let's get to the government, because the government's not making this easy on anybody. If you look at the Biden's recent ruling on navigable waters and protected waters by the federal government, he basically includes every creek, dry stream, and, drainage trench on every farm across the country. This is an extreme government overreach of the use of farmland, probably one of the most extreme overreaches we've ever seen. And it's going to impact the cost of farmland because now you have to buy even more land in order to make it productive. It's going to impact what farmers can do with their land. It's going to cause a lot of farmers to face fines. It's going to cause a lot of serious issues for farmers in the future.
America's farmers and ranchers are urging the Biden administration to reverse a recent change they made to the Clean Water Act. They're worried it's putting an even bigger burden on their ability to do business. Zippy Duval, president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, putting out a statement saying, quote, farmers and ranchers share the goal of protecting the nation's waterways, but they deserve rules that don't require a team of attorneys and consultants to identify navigable waters on their land. John Boyd Jr., president of the National Black Farmers Association.
I think what happens here is the farmers themselves can't figure out the gray areas in these actual laws. That's what's problematic for us, and that's why we have to seek out consultants and attorneys. And that's more money that's leaving our bottom line from our farming operation. The government, in this case EPA, should be helping us sustain and stay on our farms rather than putting policy in place that's going to cause America's farmers more grief and more money. Again, farmers know how to respect creeks and waterways. These are things that my forefathers taught me very, very early on, Thomas Boyd and John Boyd Sr. They taught me to respect the land, and if I take care of the land will always take care of me. And we don't need the USDA or EPA to tell us how to do that.
I remember from my time living in California that this water rights is a huge issue. And to me, this continues a pattern by the left, really preventing farmers from getting the water they need to grow crops. That seems like fourth grade life sciences. You need water to grow plants and to grow food. The fact that the Biden administration is making it more difficult for you is not right. John Boyd Jr., thank you for your time, sir. As always, we appreciate it.
And I'm all for it. Like you guys know from watching this, I'm doing a bison documentary. I am, in my heart, a true environmentalist. I spend a lot of time caring about the environment. I want us to take care of our waterways. But the extent of overreach of this recent definition of the federally protected waters is one that goes way beyond reason. It goes way beyond anything. And the only reason why it reaches as far as it does is to have this overreach onto farmland, to control the farmland. There is no other reason why they would have had this type of extension on their definition. I mean, it is clearly one of the most, well, I have a lot of words for it, and I'm not even going to go there. But you guys remember what happened in Idaho, where the government pretty much came in and said, if you have a pond on your property, guess what? We own it. If you've got a stream, if a creek, even if the creek is dry under federal law, for most of the year, it's still protected if water runs through it if there's a hurricane. I think that this is going to be a very serious situation. It's gone to the Supreme Court on whether or not it will be constitutional. I don't see how it could be, but we never really know what's going to happen there. And if anything, it gives us a perspective of what they're trying to do. They're trying to have this overreach on landowners, this massive overreach on everything. And what's surprising about it is, under the laws, you can't even repair a fence going across a dry creek bed that has water running through it every now and then. But down the road, they're building a massive, electric car plant that's going to disrupt waterways, bigger waterways that are flood zones even, in one of our major riverbeds, and they're getting away with it. They're able to just go in there and flatten it all out and have the runoff going into the river, but yet a farmer can't repair a barbed wire fence. I mean, this is how ridiculous this ruling is from the Biden administration. And I think it just, when you couple this with the things that they've tried to do with their tax regulations, this is an attack on landowners. This is an attack on farmers. There's no other way to look at it. At the same time they're doing this, there's two other events going on right now with the EPA that's going to dramatically impact the cattle business, the pig business, the pork business, the poultry business, all of them. And now those are, they're doing an environmental impact study on CAFOs and their impacts on our waterways. And now that we've expanded the definition of what those waterways are, this could be a very interesting way of shutting down CAFOs. I don't like CAFOs, okay? And people give me a hard time for saying that. I don't like the way that they are operated. But I see their necessity and I understand what it takes to feed billions of people. This will impact the protein industry across the board. They're going to put out a new set of regulations against CAFOs that are going to make it extraordinarily difficult unless you're really big to operate. Now, they're going to couple this with an investigation into Tyson and Cargill and JBS, but ultimately, just like in past years under Vilsack, that investigation is going to fall apart, fall to the wayside. It's going to make farmers excited about what's going on because they're going to think, oh, they're finally taking out the big meat guys. But in reality, nothing is ever going to happen there. They've done this numerous of times and nothing has ever happened. And while they're doing that, they're going to be shutting down every small CAFO across the country by putting in overregulation based on this new waterway ruling and its environmental impact on waterways. This is all happening right now. I'm not making this stuff up. At a time when we should actually be very concerned about our food security in the United States, we seem to be pushing forward with these regulations and ridiculous oversight that are making things even worse. And talk about coincidences, just things happening coincidentally. There just happened to be a large hog farmer here in North Carolina who had a pipe mysteriously break and flood a waterway just as the EPA decided to to announce that they were doing this new environmental study. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how many other coincidences we have along this way. I mean, just look at, you have an egg farm catch on fire when we have an egg shortage. You have grain mills going up in flames, and organic grain headquarters going up in flames as we're having all of these different shortages and things going on. But if there is one thing, you can't just point suspiciously at all of these different coincidences and say that they're all conspiracies, although they are awfully coincidental. But you can look at what is going on with regulations, what is coming out of this administration, and seeing how it's impacting the agricultural community at a time when the agricultural community is actually fairly weakened because of other conditions going on. It's almost like a war of two fronts for farmers. And I think that it's going to have a greater impact on our protein supply than many of you think. So if you don't want to be eating bugs and you don't want to be eating mushroom burgers, there's a new mushroom burger ranch is what they're calling it in Colorado, a mushroom burger ranch. I don't even know how that correlates, but it's basically a big plant building mushroom burgers. If you don't want to be eating mushroom burgers or overprocessed fake meats, then you need to figure out not just a way to stock up, but stocking up is only going to help you for a year. All right, you can increase your cold storage. You can get some freezers going. You can go buy a quarter cow. You can go buy, a hog, whatever it is, and put it in there. But unless you figure out, number one, a way to raise your own meat, or number two, a way to partner with a local farmer, find a local source, going to the grocery store is not going to be an option. And you need to build those alliances now, because I can tell you that when those farmers get overbooked by an oversupply of people wanting to buy their meat products because it becomes in short supply on the shelves, if you're not in that loop, unfortunately, you're not going to be in the loop. I mean, it's not like they don't want to sell to you. It's just that they can only produce so much. I mean, we're actually going to be cutting back on the amount of protein with these regulations from the EPA that we can produce, more so than we ever have in the past. And I think that all of this is coming to a head at a very interesting time. And like I said, you have all these things adding up to 2030. And I don't believe a lot of these catastrophic events that are going to happen in 2030, especially with climate change. But I do believe in what I'm seeing with our natural cycles and what I think could be happening at that time, that coincidentally aligns with all of these other catastrophic events by 2030 and New World Order by 2030. All these different things going on by 2030 just happen to align with some of those natural cycles. So I would be very cautious going forward on what you think of this stuff. I think that there are a lot of headwinds to recovery here, and I don't think that we have fully gotten through the depths of what's happening with the cattle industry or this bird flu. And like I said, I've been watching, there's nothing alarming yet, but I've been watching this African swine flu as it kind of rebounds in different countries right now, just to see what happens, because we are a global market, and so anything that happens globally impacts us here in the U.S., and it impacts what we pay for pricing, what we pay for feed, what we pay for meat, what we pay for all these different things. That's what commodities are. They're common oddities that we all have to have that we don't produce ourselves, so we buy them and exchange them, and it becomes a global industrialized system. And wherever there are weak spots, it ends up impacting everybody. And it just so happens that I think this year in the U.S. we're going to start really seeing some of those impacts, at least with poultry. You've seen it with eggs, and we're going to start really feeling it with beef, and it's not going to lighten up anytime soon. So this is all some pretty serious stuff. And like I said, at a time when the headwinds seem to be enough, the government seems to be picking up steam in regulations and oversight of how this stuff is done, and they're about to make some significant changes over the next couple years that are going to make things even more difficult for recovery, more difficult, and ultimately reduce our natural protein sources. I know there's probably downloaded a lot of information, but I want you to understand how the system works and the challenges that we face going forward. I want you to be prepared for it, and I want you to think about ways that you can be that you can contribute to that, whether it's contributing to a local farmer, contributing to your own household, whatever it takes. It's time that we start to take food security more seriously as Americans. It's time that we return to our own sovereignty when it comes to food, understanding where our food comes from, because if we don't, the control over the food that's left, the supply, is going to be very isolated. And believe it or not, most of it comes from 6 or 7 companies now. That isolation is going to be coming more so in the downline stream, the farmers producing it. And the more control that our food supply is given to an isolated group, unfortunately, the less liberties you have as people. I mean, this is directly related. Anyway, hope you guys have a good day, and buy some buffalo wool products. It's going to get pretty cold. If we're going to see a cold spell at the end of February, and then from what I've been reading, we could expect an Arctic polar vortex late in winter, and that I think is going to impact, depending on when that hits, it could impact spring planting this year. So definitely get yourself some warmed up so you can get out there and work, and I'll talk to you guys soon.